So, Dave, how much was truly on the line for Vince McMahon with WrestleMania 1?
Um, I mean, the answer at the time seemed to be everything, and I
Hmm.
think it kind of was. If But there's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's like he was in debt, so he would have probably, if it had failed, I don't know that the company would have gone under, but he would have had to take on partners, and that would have changed the whole dynamic of everything. I mean, the story they like to tell is that it was do or die, and I don't know that it was that much, but at the time, it absolutely felt like it was that much, and I think in his mind, it was that much. And what a lot of people forget is that, I mean, nobody knew this was totally uncharted water for professional wrestling. I mean, yeah, Starrcade, they did the closed circuit, but that was within within their territory. It was a lot lower cost and a lot lower risk. This was all over North American closed circuit, and the advances were terrible a week out. So it looked like it was a disaster. Ed Cohen, who was booking the buildings, he canceled like 68 buildings the week of the show, and some of the buildings did very well, had good advances, and some of them had really bad advances. And then that last week they lucked into somebody got sick, and it because of that, Hulk Hogan and Mr. T at the last minute ended up doing Saturday night's main event hosting,
Hmm.
which ended up really helping. And then Hulk Hogan had the thing with Richard Belzer, which got a ton of attention. I mean, it ended up costing Hogan some money, and I think Vince even more. When he basically choked him out with a front face lock with a guillotine, and let him go, and the guy fell right on his face on the floor and busted his head open and everything. And but it got a lot of attention. And then there was they were on the Letterman show as well, and they were everywhere, because of Mr. T. Mr. T got him a lot of attention, and so in the end, it was a very successful show. And when it was over, they were out of debt, and they really didn't have any what I would call strong financial problems. I mean, they had little bits here and there, but I mean, like, what I would call real financial problems till the 90s. I mean, they had a big long run after that where they were, pretty much very successful.
Was wrestling, Dave, actually, or at least the WWF, actually as hip then as it's portrayed now in retrospect with like MTV and the war to settle the score and all of that? Can you sort of put us in the moment as to how hip and happening wrestling felt in 1985 around WrestleMania 1?
Oh, it was big. I personally think from a cultural standpoint, WrestleMania 1 was the biggest of any WrestleMania. I mean, it wasn't, obviously from a financial standpoint, these recent WrestleManias dwarf it, but and WrestleMania 3 was bigger to the wrestling fans, but it was not bigger to culture by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, this one was. I mean, I just remember being around on that day. That's the day of the first WrestleMania, and I was using on public transportation, and everybody was talking about WrestleMania. And I'm not talking about being around the arena. I'm just talking about like miles away from anything. And then they had like out here we had I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 in the Bay Area closed circuit places, because it was a closed circuit show. It wasn't really a pay-per-view. There were some pay-per-view systems that had it, but pay-per-view was in its infancy at the time.
Mm.
And so there were about 13,000 tickets in the Bay Area, and every one of them was sold. Every building was sold out because of and it was all and it was walk up. None of them had big advances or anything. So it was one of those things which of course is very scary if you're the promoter and you're looking at these advances and they're not very good, not realizing that for whatever reason this was a decision people made at the last minute based on the last week of hype. Kind of like a kind of like the way you decide to buy a pay-per-view as opposed to when you decide to go to an arena show. Generally, when you decide to go to an arena show with you and your friends, you're getting your tickets a month out.
Right.
This was a different dynamic, and so that's why they were so scared and they canceled those dates. And but it came up. But yeah, I would say, yeah, because of and a lot of that, you had the MTV thing. I mean. In February, the angle where Mr. T came in from Madison Square Garden was in mid-February, and it was on MTV, and it did a 9 rating, which was one of the highest ratings in the history of MTV, and one of the highest ratings for something that's not the NFL or some catastrophic world event.
Yeah.
As far as cable, I mean, so yeah, it was really big culturally, yes.
Now, Hulk Hogan, of course, was the face of the organization at this point in time. He was the pop culture guy that they were trying to get the rub off Mr. T, and he was already a big star in pro wrestling. Now, there's a lot of lore about Hogan's exodus from the AWA and coming over to the WWF and being anointed this top guy, and this idea that Hogan left the AWA in part because Vern Gagne didn't want to put the championship on him, or was hesitant in some way about putting the championship on him. And I wonder, if Vern Gagne dealt with Hogan differently, Dave, do you think there would have been a WrestleMania?
No. Hulk was going to go. He was going to go. He was going to go no matter what.
Okay.
I mean, I think the whole championship story it makes a nice story, but I never bought that for a second. Number one, I mean, there were political reasons why Vern wouldn't put the championship on him, because Vern essentially had a deal with All Japan Pro Wrestling where his champion would go work for Giant Baba. And Hogan had a deal with New Japan Pro Wrestling that was pre-existing before he went to work for the AWA, that Vince's father actually set up, Vincent James McMahon, and he got over big there, and so he became a New Japan guy. And I mean, if he would have switched over to All Japan, he could have gotten the AWA title. But what I always tell people, and I 100% believe this, that if Hogan was AWA champion, it would have been far worse for Vern Gagne, because he would have left and he would have never done the job and lost the title on the way out. So it's just as well that he never won that championship, even though, in the AWA, it makes a good story to say, well, Vern wouldn't give him the title. I mean, Vern would have gladly given him the title, except there were those political issues. And if they could have worked through those political issues, he would have got the title. But Hogan's going either way, because you got a guy who's telling you, he's going to make this thing mainstream. He's based in New York and everything like that. And he's also affiliated with New Japan, which is the same affiliation Hogan had. And Hogan, for all the talk about AWA, Hogan's money was in New Japan. I mean, he made far more in Japan than he made in the United States. I mean, it was kind of like the AWA was like his secondary job between New Japan tours. It wasn't like he would go to Japan, once or twice a year, and his main job was AWA. That wasn't what it was. And I mean, and that's another reason why it was difficult for Vern to make him world champion, because his primary job was New Japan Pro Wrestling.
Why do you think Vince thought Hulk Hogan was the guy?
Because he was the guy. I mean, there was no doubt in my mind, if I was in Vince's position, that Hulk Hogan was the guy. There were I would say there were three guys at that point in time. If you go, okay, we're going to build something. And they were Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, and Kerry Von Erich. Well, Kerry Von Erich is owned, locked, with his father. Okay,
right.
So and Vince wanted Kerry Von Erich really bad. I mean, and you could say Jimmy Snuka, but Jimmy Snuka was already like 40, 41, and he had drug issues, and he had a lot of issues. He had arrest issues and things like that. That he was unpredictable, and you couldn't really count on him at all. And he was older anyway. Vince wanted to build a new guy. He didn't want to go with a 40-year-old guy on top. He had Backlund, but Backlund wasn't the guy. There's no doubt. Not for national expansion. So you had Kerry, who was locked up elsewhere, and also had his drug issues, and in some ways, Kerry, I think, was more Vince's guy, because he was even younger than Hogan, and he was more of a bodybuilder than Hogan, and he was very charismatic, and he drew more women. And then you had Flair, who really wasn't Vince's guy and was very loyal to Jim Crockett anyway. So, Hogan was the guy. That was, Flair and Hogan were the two guys, and then Kerry, I guess, would be the third. I mean, they were the guys as far as being able to really move numbers. I mean, Hogan, on the AWA in Minneapolis, just as an example, if Hogan was on the show, they would usually draw between 14 and 18,000. If he wasn't on the show, they would draw 8,000. I mean, he was a huge money draw, like nobody's business. So it was already proven. It wasn't like Vince took this guy with no track record and made him into a star. I mean, this guy was the star. Him and Flair were like the two big stars in the country already, and it was just a question of. And Vince was a big guy. He liked big guys, and WWF was built around big guys. Hogan, there was little question, if he's going to go national, that the guy you're plucking to be your top star at that point in time in late 1983 is Hulk Hogan.
Did it help, Dave, at the time in terms of getting mainstream folks interested in having them on talk shows and the like, that Hogan had been in Rocky III?
Slightly, yeah. But I mean, because in those days, major shows and stuff really weren't going to feature wrestlers. But what was a lot more important than that was Cyndi Lauper being involved, because she was a genuine star,
Yeah.
unlike the wrestlers. And Mr. T was, Mr. T was like he may have been the biggest TV star in the country at the time. I mean, he was huge. And it was the affiliation with those two that made Hogan, because in even the day of WrestleMania in 1985, okay, and the biggest star on that show, or the two biggest stars on that show, were Mr. T was number one, and Cyndi Lauper was number two, and Hulk Hogan was number three. Now, to wrestling fans, Hulk Hogan was number one, but to the public, it was Mr. T wrestling. That's what made the first WrestleMania. It wasn't, and Roddy Piper, I think, more than Hulk Hogan. But when it was over, Hulk Hogan was the big star, and he got the rub, and he got to do the bodyguard thing with Cyndi Lauper at the Grammys one year when Cyndi Lauper won a bunch of awards, and they put him in the right place, in the right, in the right settings, and he was really big and muscular at a time when there weren't a lot of really big muscular guys of that size running around. So when he would be on the show, I mean, he did, I think he did Johnny Carson, and this was actually still in the AWA. And, you just had a guy who was that big and muscular, wearing the tight T-shirt and everything. And, if people watched it, it was and he had some charisma, and he could talk a little bit. And people did know him from the Rocky movie too. So, the Rocky movie, I think, helped him a little bit in the AWA. But the reality is that he started in the AWA and was already over before that movie hit the theaters. So it was only a little bit of a help, but the thing was, it's like there was a segment of the public that knew Hulk Hogan, the wrestler, that were wrestling fans, and there was a segment of the public that knew the big blonde guy, Thunder Lips, and Rocky, and then there were people who didn't know who he was at all, but then started seeing him around Cyndi Lauper and Mr. T, and so by the time WrestleMania comes in '85, all of a sudden, Hogan's like a genuine celebrity at this point. So, and that really got them rolling for the next couple of years.
Dave, every WrestleMania has featured a match for the WWF title except the first one. Well, why do you think they didn't have Hogan defend the belt on the first WrestleMania?
Because it wouldn't have worked. They weren't at that level, and Mr. T sold that WrestleMania, so you needed the tag match. Because if you had Mr. T team with Jimmy Snuka, then Jimmy Snuka gets the rub. The key was to use Mr. T to give Hulk Hogan the rub. Hulk Hogan was the star of that match, but Mr. T was the one who brought people in to watch that match and got the media attention of that match. And the idea was, and it was perfect, it worked perfectly, that you would go in to see Mr. T fight Roddy Piper, essentially, but it was a tag match, and you would leave thinking, God, the big blonde guy, he's really charismatic, and you would remain a wrestling fan after that, and maybe not everyone did, but a lot of people did.
And finally, on WrestleMania 1, Dave, the story of the bounty on Hogan and Bruiser Brody.
Yes. Very overblown. Although it was absolutely mentioned to him, but I don't think that anyone mentioned it to him in a way where, put it this way, it was never going to happen, but it was something that people talked about, like, attack him as he goes to the ring and ruin WrestleMania. But, then you're getting police arrests and things like that. And I mean, those promoters, it was something promoters, would talk about, like, oh, we're going to bump off Vince or something like that. I'm sure those words were said because it was a very heated promotional war at the time, and these guys were fighting for their lives. But I mean, as far as, was there ever any chance it was going to happen? No. There was never any chance it was going to happen.